Okay, so we're going to be moving from articulation to perception in this part of the lecture. And what we noticed last time when we were trying to reason our way through an articulatory phonology model of local place assimilation, in that case, uh, was that the general articulatory framework, where you have physical gestures and they can extend in time and overlap with one another, that will get you general assimilation, but it's not quite enough. So, in addition to that general idea of gestural spreading, it looks like assimilation and typology of assimilation is also sensitive to the perceptual consequences of different patterns of gestural timing. Oops, excuse me. Um, yeah, and in particular, we saw that there's no particular physical reason why it would be hard to do nasality and frication at the same time. There's nothing physically hard about it. It's just that it would be hard to do them at the same time in a way where they'll both be heard by the listener. Right? And so, in addition, above and beyond these general facts about how we coordinate articulatory gestures and motions in time, also, if we want to get some mileage out of the phonetics by putting it into the phonology, we're going to have some kinds of constraints that reflect perception and how easy versus hard it is to perceive different kinds of things. So it looks like that's going to need to be part of our theory of grammar as well, if we're going to try to ground phonological representations in phonetic facts rather than having these baroque complex autosegmental representations. So there's going to be constraints on the kinds of articulations that go into pronouncing language, but also constraints on the perceptibility of the outputs that we end up with. Right? So given that we already have a preliminary reason for thinking that there are constraints like this, the next question is, well, what can we get out of those perceptual constraints? And here, this is not what we started out with. We started out with this sort of ban on nasal fricatives across many languages, and asked why that might be. But actually, this idea of perceptual constraints is going to help us get at one of the most central features of both assimilation and of many of the other phonological patterns that we've seen in both semesters now, namely their contextual asymmetries, that all of these patterns of neutralization, assimilation, whatever, they all tend to happen in certain phonetic contexts and not in others. Right? And in particular, with regard to place of articulation assimilation, for major place assimilation, assimilations where one consonant takes on the place of the following consonant, called regressive assimilation, are extremely common. In fact, every single place of articulation example that we've seen in this class involves regressive assimilation. So in a sequence of like plus ka, we're not seeing languages where the place of the stop changes to reflect the nasal. Instead, we're seeing only cases where the place of the nasal changes to reflect the stop or to match it. So it's regressive assimilation. And this is a broad generalization that almost all of the place of articulation assimilations that we find across languages are almost always regressive. And we have not yet built anything into our theory that helps explain why that is, right? So all of the things that we've done so far, possible exception of aperture theory, depending on how you interpret it, basically all of these frameworks predict that it would be just as easy to spread place of articulation forward onto the following consonant as it is to spread it backwards on the preceding consonant. Yet this is not true, clearly not true. It's much, much more common to get place of articulation spreading backwards. Here are some, we've seen lots and lots of synchronic examples, so particular examples from particular grammars in both semesters now. And then Ohala, in this paper, The Phonetics and Phonology of Aspects of Assimilation, he gives a bunch of historical examples. So I'm just showing you here, this is not only well attested within an individual person's grammar at one point in time, it's also attested as a very, very common sound change over historical time. So some examples here from Ohala. In late Latin, we have sequences of two stops with differing places of articulation. These would be scriptu and nocte, where we have labial followed by a coronal. And here, this is written as a C, but it's a velar stop followed by a coronal. And if you look at later stages of one branch of late Latin, namely modern standard Italian, what you find here is not mismatching places of articulation in these sequences. Instead, you find geminates, so scritto and notte. And so what's happened here over time is that the first stop eventually took on the place of articulation of the second one, and they ended up agreeing in place of articulation and therefore being identical. So very, very, very common. There are very few cases, and maybe none, where words like scriptu turn into words like scrippo with a labial geminate. That doesn't seem to happen. Assimilation is almost always regressive for a major place of articulation. There's an example here from Old Sanskrit into modern Pali. And here you see basically the same thing. So this is just working exactly like the Italian examples. You have these sequences of different places of articulation word medially here. And it's always the second consonant whose place of articulation is spreading to the first one. There's more examples here from Old Irish. And then these are the examples involving nasals and stops. These ones all involve just oral stops. These ones show nasal place assimilation as a diachronic or historical sound change. So late Latin similarly had this phrase primu tempus, which I think means first season. And then in older versions of French before the nasalization happened, this would have come out something like printemps, where we lost this vowel, the nasal ended up adjacent to a stop, and then it took on the place of assimilation of that following stop. Now, in modern French, because there's also been lots of things that happened with nasal consonants and nasalization on adjacent vowels, this is not pronounced printemps anymore. It's pronounced something like printemps. But there was a stage of French where those nasal consonants were pronounced in more or less the way they're written here. Similarly, what is this? Amita. From late Latin becomes Old French ante, and this is modern French tante, which I think means aunt, as far as I remember. Yeah, and so it's the same type of thing here, regardless of what that word actually is. I might be getting it wrong. It starts out with a nasal and a stop that are separated by a vowel. That vowel gets dropped out at some stage on the transition into Old French, and once the nasal and the stop are next to each other, the nasal takes on the place of articulation of the following stop, and not vice versa. So again, regressive assimilation, regressive assimilation. The Shona example here is really interesting. And so in modern Shona, what you actually get in these cases, Shona is a Bantu language and it has this nasal prefix, as we've now seen in about a dozen different Bantu languages in this class. And interesting things happen when you get this nasal prefix onto different stems. In modern Shona, my understanding is basically what happens is a voiceless stop just falls out and it becomes this kind of breathy voiced or aspirated nasal segment at the beginning of a word. Historically, they've reconstructed that the first thing that happened here was the nasal prefix assimilated to an aspirated stop, and then eventually it ended up completely covered, the nasality covered up the oral stop part of this, and what you ended up with was just basically nasality followed by a period of aspiration, but where the voicing hasn't cut out yet phonetically. And so they reconstruct an intermediate stage in here where this nasal, again, assimilated in place to a following consonant, not the consonant assimilating in place to the nasal. In fact, we don't even know what the original place of articulation of this nasal was because it always assimilates to a following stop. Here, interestingly, over time, it looks like the nasal assimilated in place to a following voice stop as well, but then at some point it turned the voice stop into an implosive, which is kind of interesting. And I can't explain to you exactly why that is, but the main point here is simply that we do have diachronic here, across time assimilation, and it looks just like the synchronic or at a moment in time examples that we've been seeing for the last 2 semesters. Nasal place assimilation to a following stop is extremely, extremely common. One of the things these Shona examples are showing us, this is sort of an aside, it's a tangent, but it's worth noting. We might have originally wanted to characterize these nasal place assimilation patterns as saying that nasals assimilate when they're in syllable coda position. Because in these examples, or segments want to assimilate when they're in syllable codas, right? Because in these examples, scrip tu, it's the coda p that assimilates. It's the coda k here that assimilates. Same here, prin temp. It's the coda one that assimilates. These examples are showing us that it's not about being a syllable coda, right? Because these are word initial. There is no syllable for them to be the coda of. It's really just about being next to a stop, interestingly. So this reverse pattern that we haven't seen here, where hypothetically the second consonant would take on the place of articulation of the first one, that's referred to as progressive assimilation. And for major place features, it is extremely rare. In fact, all of the cases that I know of progressive place of articulation assimilation for major place features, are mostly in Germanic languages, and they almost always involve a situation where the first consonant is part of a root and the second consonant is part of an affix. So there might be a separate explanation for these. This might not really be about an asymmetry in which phonological position is more likely to lose its place features. It may really be about their morphological status, that we're more willing to change around affixes than we are stems. In any case, those are the only examples I know of. It's extremely rare, and the few cases I do know of might have another analysis anyway. Here's what Ohala poses to us as an interesting question or problem. Right? People like to appeal to ease of articulation to explain major place assimilation, right? It kind of sounds intuitive, like producing two sounds with the same place of articulation is just easier than producing two sounds with different places of articulation. But really, trying to get any details out of this theory, it's extremely vague and fuzzy. There's no way to quantify ease of articulation, really. And there's not even a real theory of what would count as effort or ease of articulation. And Ohala says that even if there were such a theory, it couldn't possibly tell us why regressive assimilation would be more common than progressive, right? So basically, Ohala at this point in 1990 is basically where we are after the last handout. There's this idea floating around out there that a lot of local assimilation just has to do with articulatory overlap and the fact that phonological representations have to be implemented physically in terms of gestures, right? And he's saying, well, yeah, that's all well and good, but actually, first of all, this notion of ease of articulation, we don't really have a good handle on that at all. And second of all, there's this much more obvious fact here, which is that these place of articulation assimilations for major place features basically always go backwards, and ease of articulation can't tell us anything about that. So what can tell us about that? Here's what Ohala's hypothesis is. Assimilation depends more on hearers than it does on speakers. So it's not about principles of articulation or speech production. It's about how things are heard by listeners. The first consonant frequently assimilates in major place to the second one because the perceptual cues to place of articulation are weaker in that first consonant. So when you have two consonants with two different places of articulation in a sequence like that, listeners will frequently mishear the place of the first consonant as a consequence. Over time, as a language is transmitted from one generation to the next, these kinds of misperceptions, which Ohala famously refers to as innocent misapprehensions, those will multiply over time. And after, a couple generations, couple hundred years, eventually the language will only be left with assimilated clusters, right? So the idea here is that, people speaking late Latin were saying primu tempus a lot, and they were saying it faster and faster, and eventually the vowel dropped out, and they were saying prim tempus, prim temps, prim temps, and people misheard the place of articulation of this nasal because it's the cues, the phonetic cues to place of articulation in this position are just not as good as the ones for the t. And so in the end, all that was left was this word printemps. And if this happens everywhere in the late Latin lexicon, then in modern French, all we're going to be, or actually this would probably be Old French, all we're going to be left with are these assimilated nasal stop sequences. This is the Ohala idea, the innocent misapprehension theory of assimilation. This is also an inherently diachronic or historical theory. It's about language transmission. The reason we end up with assimilated sequences is because it's hard to hear the unassimilated ones and people don't learn them properly, basically. So here's some preliminary supporting evidence. First of all, think way, way, way back to September. We looked at this paper by Fujimura and colleagues, and they reported perception experiments on English and Japanese listeners showing that place cues in sequences of two consonants in between two vowels, that the place cues are much stronger for the second consonant than for the first one. So this was way back a long time ago that we looked at this paper. There's a handout about it. The paper itself is on that 411 website. And it showed pretty clearly that people hear the place of articulation of C2 much better than they do C1. There's also earlier work, some of this from the Haskins laboratories. So there's a paper by Householder from the 1950s showing that unreleased stops in particular are frequently misidentified. People have a hard time hearing the place of articulation of stops that don't have audible releases. That makes sense because some of the phonetic cues to place of articulation reside in the release of the stop. Right? And Maleko showed that nasals at different places of articulation are even easier to confuse than stops at different places of articulation. So basically, major place cues in nasals are generally just much less clear than they are in oral stops. So that's also interesting. That might help explain why nasals, if this is really about perception of place of articulation, then nasals, which have weaker cues to begin with, should be even more subject to place assimilation than oral stops are. And that appears to be true, right? So we have many languages where nasals assimilate in place to a following stop, but stops don't, right? And I don't think we've seen any languages yet where stops assimilate, oral stops assimilate to a following stop, but nasals don't. That pattern we have not seen in this class. So this is more support for this Ohala idea. Ohala is going to do a very similar experiment to what Fujimura and colleagues did, but we discussed that a long time ago, so I'll go over this one too. He's going to record stops and nasal stop sequences in the context in between two ah vowels. We'll call these V1 and V2. And then he's going to cross splice V1, this ah, and the nasal, if it's there, right, for the nasal ones only, from one place of articulation, with the stop burst and V2 from a different place of articulation, and he's going to put them together. Ask listeners to identify the results. Hey, what do you hear over here? And if the C2 cues, place cues are stronger than C1, then we'd expect most answers to track the place of the release and not of the closure. So in terms of actual segments, he's going to be recording these stimuli. He did this varying stress, which is not super important, but I just include it for completeness here. So up here we have appa, abba, ampa, amba, so on and so forth. Down here we have apa, abba, ampa, amba. And this is at labial, coronal, and dorsal places of articulation. And then he's going to cross splice to make new stimuli. And so here I'm showing you only the oral stop ones. He did this with the nasals as well. Results are very similar. So here's what this might look like concretely. These are original recordings of me saying apa and aka, and I've put the cursor here right before the release burst of the stops. So what we have here is the preceding schwa-like vowel, and then these formant transitions into the closure of p in this case and k in this case. And if you listen to these parts, the white parts in isolation, you can hear what consonant's coming up next. It's very clear. It sounds like an unreleased stop that you'd get at the end of a word, maybe. But what he did here was to then cross splice. So he'd take the closure from one of these, which has cues to place of articulation, and put the release from the other one in its place here, and do vice versa for these two. So in the particular example I'm giving you here, we're going to take the vowel and closure part from this one and the release plus following vowel part of this one and combine them together. And this is my hybrid Frankenstein ap ka. stimulus. So this has the vowel and formant transitions from a labial stop. Here's the splicing point, and I'm going to put in here the burst and following vowel from a dorsal stop. And the question is, what will people hear? I've actually created these stimuli and posted them on the website if you want to go take a quick look, or take a quick listen, rather. Um, and yeah, so the result, overwhelmingly, 93% of the answers identified the place of articulation as being the second consonant, the one with the burst and the following formant transitions into the vowel. And this matches what Fujimura and colleagues found, more or less. So this one, ka, is going to be heard as a dorsal stop, much more than a labial one. So that definitely supports this idea that consonants that assimilate in major place features are those whose major place is harder to hear than the ones, in this case, before a vowel. Right. Another nice consequence here, if these perceptibility facts extend more generally to consonants preceding a vowel, like ka, versus those that aren't before a vowel, it can help us explain not just why we get assimilatory neutralization for these consonants like unreleased p here, but also why we find frequent neutralization of place contrasts at the ends of words, right? So at the ends of words, we find non-assimilatory place neutralization. And in particular, we've seen examples of this in Cellierese, Slavey, and Spanish so far in this class. And for nasals, this usually shows up as a kind of default nasal. So it's a coronal nasal word finally in most Spanish varieties, although it might be velar or placeless in some. In Cellierese, which was on your homework, I believe the final realization is as a I want to say a velar nasal. And then in Slavey, this is a debuccalization language where basically oral stops just lose all of their place features in word final position. If this is also about perceptibility, then we can help explain why you get place of articulation neutralization in non-prevocalic contexts in general. So that's a very promising application of this idea. I'm going to split out the rest of this handout into a separate mini lecture, but we'll come back and talk about why different contexts and different cues, how this might get into the phonology of assimilation.